I would like to just briefly introduce our poets and also discuss a bit the three working criteria that guided my decision to invite Charles Bernstein, Elena Qui, Nada Gordon, and Rod Smith to create this afternoon's collaboration of word and image. I see in their poetry fantasy as the configuration of a conceptual space that undoes itself or undoes its configuration. Fantasy as the reconfiguration of a familiar conceptual space in such a way as to dissolve it. And finally, fantasy as the presentation of an untranslatable or only partially translatable experience. In this sense, fantasy is a sense memory, just as in Hein Gross's fantasy drawings. I will introduce very briefly all the poets in the order in which they will read, so that we can have an uninterrupted flow of poetry, and immediately after a conversation about poetry, fantasy, and experience. Since the program includes biographical notes, I will be again brief with regard to the poet's voluminous accomplishments. The first poet who will read this afternoon is Nada Gordon. Nada Gordon is the author of several books, most recently Scented Rushes and Folly. She is currently editing an anthology of love poetry. It is impossible not to fall in love with Gordon's consciousness at angles with itself, because Gordon has managed to arrange these angles, Dada, Flarf, Punk, Whitmanian and language-oriented practices into a most attractive and syncretic poiesis meant to produce extreme possibilities of representation. Fantasy here takes the form of vertiginous writing, delirious burlesque, and at its outer limit, folly. Reading Gordon, one gains the sense that the work of fantasy can take over a linguistic environment with rambunctious and yet incantatory force. Each poem then is the scene of a compulsory writing of fantasy, the site where fantasy produces its work and then undoes it in a fashion independent of the writer's intention, although it could be argued that this independence is itself a fantasy, one that writes itself sometimes into nonsense, but more often into sculptural constructs of enigmatic beauty, clay, melodic waves of luminosity. Fantasy dissolves, and Gordon reports with decreasing attention over high. Fantasy leads, the writer follows gleefully. As Gordon says, I'll take irrelevance over the union of wholes. Rod Smith. Rod Smith is the author of 9 books, including Deed, Music or Honesty, In Memory of My Theories. He is currently working on the selected letters of Robert Creeley, which he is co-editing with Kaplan Harris and Peter Baker for the University of California Press. In a brief interview with Amy Wright, Smith talks about his interest in poetics and in poetic texts that are so constructed as to be valued for other than their quantifiable meaning. This text, Smith says, necessarily partake of a gestural contingent motion, and I think of this contingent motion as a motion of fantasy, a reconfiguration of the familiar, the everyday, the quotidian, a reconfiguration meant to enact a dissolution. Fantasy in Smith channels a poetics that questions, but more often frontally attacks the latent impenetrability of the narrative quiescence of the everyday, which Smith finds not unlike the bitter, ragged lattice work of emotion we are forced to re-encode for no reason. The familiar then, through this work of reconfiguration, stands exposed as an unsatisfying document, a stammering discourse made of insufficiencies, contradictions, improbabilities, a document that shows the laboriousness of its assembling in the, quote, break sickness of stilted words. hold. Elena Qui's books include surface tension, decoy, voice-over, and ripple effect. A new collection, Click and Clone, is forthcoming in 2011. This latest book, Qui tells me, draws on fantasy much more than usual in order to explore and react against the way technology has taken over our lives. In a classic understanding of fantasy, the subject's role is not fixed, but rotates among various positions. The subject splits, multiplies, slides into other subjects, or becomes its own object. Subjectivity is thus more firmly located in the syntax of the scenario than in any one position. And such scenarios are, in Qui's poetry, especially terse, carefully portrayed and often numerous poses of being, poses that allow for the unfolding of the rotation of the subject's role, its splitting, multiplication, sliding, and becoming object. This rotation is enhanced by the senses, especially touch and smell, for Qui, uniquely among poets, does not privilege sight and hearing. The subject of this rotation is the central embodiment of epistemic desires. Fantasy then occurs as an event that glorifies the act of knowing, and this event is an immediate, felt reality. Charles Bernstein is the author of over 20 collections of poetry, and his work as editor and organizer is equally extensive. In 2005, he collaborated with Mimi Gross, daughter by him Gross, on Some of These Days, a response to events of 9/11. His most recent books are All the Whiskey in Heaven, Girly Man, and With Strings. A new collection titled Attack of the Difficult Poem, Essays and Inventions is forthcoming with Chicago University Press in May 2011. In a recent exchange with Bernstein, he told me he never thought his poetry was related to fantasy. Although the jacket copy of his books does use the word fantasy, often in the form of utopian fantasy. One could in fact compile a long list of terms used to describe Bernstein's work in which fantasy is arguably the actual subject. Frolic, utopia, parody, satire, play, vaudeville, invention. This poetics of fantasy is implicit, in my view, in Bernstein's programmatic anti-absorption poetics of mimetic discourse, and this anti-absorption translates as a metabolic absorption of anti-mimetic discourses. This metabolization is what Bernstein celebrates as artifice. Even at its most realistic, Bernstein's artifice is fantastic, or it serves as fantasy's fellow traveler. His poetry corrodes limits of assertion by parodic compression, which produces a kind of saturated implosion, or through the acrobatic play of interlinear and interlinguistic conflicts, and also through the elaborate coagulation and then dissolution of poetic modes. And finally, Bernstein's artifice works through excavation. For fantasy, excavates sense from language, and this act of excavation dissolves what it upholds. And ultimately, excavation goes well beyond the corrosion of satire. In all these instances, the text is too full and then too empty. Fantasy burns its confines, dissipates its forms. Fantasy cannot stay, but it might flow, however, where emptiness does exist. Thus, fantasy can become a form of memory, a way of containing, as Bernstein writes, the cost of our forgetfulness. Thank you. Let me welcome Nada Gordon first.